This online lecture examines or explores concepts relating to assessment in the classroom and specifically looks at a range of assessment strategies. But before we get into more detail about assessment, I want to revisit the principles of the backward by design approach to curriculum design proposed by Wiggins and McTeague that I believe is at the heart of effective curriculum planning, whether that's for a unit of work or for an individual lesson. Many teachers start their curriculum planning with the activities they've come across. They might have found a really fun activity on the internet or been given great ideas for teaching experience and learning experiences from other teachers, and they tend to build a unit of work around those activities. Wiggins and McTeague, and me, want you to instead begin with the end in mind. Start with the students. What do they know? What are they interested in? You know your students better than anybody. Then determine the big ideas that form the basis of your unit of work. Use the curriculum standards in the overview section for guidance. What are the burning or big ideas that are drivers of the curriculum? Then identify the desired outcomes. What do I want the students to know or understand or be able to do at the end of this lesson or unit that they don't already know, understand, or can do? So that's their learning intentions. What is acceptable evidence? What are the success criteria? So what will success look like? And then importantly, and this is the focus of today's lecture, what kind of activities or assessment strategies will reveal if the students have achieved the learning intentions? How will I know that they've learnt what I intended them to learn? Only then do you start to plan those learning experiences that reinforce the learning intentions and prepare students for assessment. Another important underpinning idea that I'd like you to think about is that of alignment. The learning intentions, the assessment tasks, and the learning experiences that you design need to be aligned with the big ideas that underpin your curriculum design. Let's have a look over here at one example where alignment is in place. The topic is sustainability. The big idea is that we need to live and work in ways that allow future generations to share in the Earth's resources. That's the definition of sustainability. Our learning intention is to develop an understanding that our choices today can affect choices available to future generations. That's my learning intention for my students. An assessment task that I think will demonstrate achievement of that learning intention is to create a plan for our school that will reduce our environmental footprint. I might then design some learning experiences that help the students to prepare for that assessment, which in turn demonstrates achievement of that learning intention, which is consistent with the big idea. So here are a couple of examples of learning experiences that I might design that align with the assessment task, the learning intention, and the big idea. Now have a look over here at this one where we don't have alignment. The topic is the Olympics. And I think there's some really purposeful reasons for studying the Olympics. They're really of great interest to most of the population in Australia, but they can also help us develop our understanding of this particular big idea, which is around Australia's national identity. Here's my learning intention. Explain and explore the role of sport within Australian culture. Now that seems to be fairly much aligned because the role of a sport helps to explain some parts of our national identity as sports heroes. However, look at the assessment task. Compare the muscle groups used in 5 Olympic sports. Not aligned. Where you get that lack of alignment, which in this example is fairly obvious, to use an understatement, you have a real problem, because the students will be focusing on the assessment task without really focusing on what you want them to learn, which is the learning intention. So when you're planning your curriculum or designing your curriculum, make sure that you have alignment as one of the underpinning foundations of your design. Time for a brief reflection. What do you think of when you hear the word assessment? Take a minute to write down your initial reactions and possibly your questions. I'm fairly certain that you will all have seen this diagram before, or if not the diagram, then be familiar with the principles of assessment. That is, assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. I want you to take a moment now to write down what strategies that relate to assessment for learning you have seen used in classrooms whilst you've been on placement, or assessment for learning strategies that you have used yourselves. Let's talk about what some of those strategies might be. Usually, assessment for learning starts with what the students already know. As a teacher, you solicit the prior knowledge through activities that also help our students to tune into the unit. You could use a Know What Learn chart, which may be familiar to you from this or other courses. You could do a brainstorm, which could take a variety of forms, such as using butcher's paper, a whiteboard, sticky notes, or an online tool such as Poplet, Padlet, or Inspiration Maps. For students who are pre-literate, ask them to draw what they know or explain it to you. You could also use a strategy like the four-corner rush, which is designed specifically for kinesthetic learners. This strategy turns assessment for learning into a game, so it's fun, but it also gives you a very quick insight into who understands and who doesn't understand the concept you are wanting to teach them. Assessment for learning helps you to know, before it's too late, if and when the students in your classroom are getting it, are understanding. Here are some other strategies that you might consider. Try asking questions to elicit understanding, or try conferencing with students, either one-to-one or in small groups, to find out where they are up to and what their understandings are. Your questions used through this conferencing will be key to unlocking whether or not your students are gaining an understanding of the learning intentions you have set. Use observation. It's often a much maligned strategy, but teacher observation is one of the most effective strategies for assessing where students may be misunderstanding or have misconceptions about certain topics. Whilst informal observation is okay, try developing or using some formal observation tools and instruments to gauge where your students are up to in their learning. Be quite specific in identifying the success criteria you are looking for. Have a matrix of those criteria against student names. Then when you observe the desired behaviour or understanding, skill or knowledge, you can check them off the matrix. This way, you can map who is understanding and who is not, and use that information to inform the teaching that you then go on with. Be prepared to shift your teaching to address those misconceptions or misunderstandings for those students. Don't just push on in the hope that they get it. To illustrate what I'm talking about, here's an example that one teacher has created for her students, listed down here, and the criteria listed across here. Here's another collection of assessment for learning strategies. You can go directly to the source and ask the students what they know. For example, get them to identify the muddiest point. What is the thing that they are most unclear about? You could also use a thumbs up, thumbs down as a quick way of checking in as to who is understanding and who isn't. Ask your students to write a one-sentence summary at the end of a lesson and hand it in to you so you can then assess who's on track and who's not. You could also try the 5 whys strategy. If you are unfamiliar with any of these strategies, a quick Google search will bring up lots of information that will help you to explore these strategies in greater depth. One of my favourites is traffic lights. Find a wall space and put the names or even photos of each of your students along the wall. Ask them to put a red, orange or green traffic light against their name. Laminated traffic lights with Velcro dots on the back of them work particularly well on carpeted or fabric areas of the wall. The colours of the traffic lights on the wall will give you a fairly quick snapshot of whether the class is understanding the concepts or not and needs some further support. You can also get a snapshot of who specifically needs what level of additional support using this strategy. Time for you to pause and reflect. I want you to take out a piece of paper and draw a Y chart. Using a blue pen, write down what assessment for learning looks like, sounds like, and feels like for a student. But leave plenty of room. You're going to add to this Y chart throughout this particular lecture. I want to move now on to the second principle of assessment, and that is assessment as learning. But before I do, again, pause the lecture and write down examples of assessment as learning that you have used or seen being used on placement. Assessment as learning, to refresh your memory, is where students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform their future learning goals. A really good example of an assessment as learning strategy is the learning log or learning journal. In Richard Battersby's classroom, you might see this referred to as the thinking book, drawn from Karen Malone's chapters in your Latham et al. Textbook, Learning to Teach, New Times, New Practices. The learning log or learning journal or thinking book, regardless of its name, can be a really useful way for students to assess their own learning. At the end of each session, they might write a brief reflection about what they've been learning, what they think their learning goals might be as a consequence. As a teacher, you might like to provide them with some prompts. If you're unsure about the thinking book idea or the learning log or learning journal, read the relevant sections of Learning to Teach. You can use the index to find out where it is. Have a look at this particular example in the diagram here. I know this is a little difficult to read, but let me try and translate. Over here, this week my learning achievements were: the things I don't get yet are: what will I do to make sure I improve this week? What will I need to help me make these improvements? What mistakes did I make that helped me to learn? What will I do to ensure I'm a good learner this week? Some really great metacognitive prompts there to assist the students with their learning logs. Another strategy is the concept circle. Students recall key concepts or ideas that are related to their current work, and they highlight or draw a box around any concept or idea that they're having trouble understanding. They can then transfer some of these ideas to their learning logs for further examination. I would like you to take out another piece of paper and draw a concept circle like the one in the slide, and complete this for the concepts that you have learned in relation to your investigation of the island. Highlight or draw a box around any concept or idea that you're having trouble understanding. I'd like you to do another concept circle, this time for the sorts of concepts that you're learning about from the online lectures. Reflect on the learning that you are undertaking in your online journal, your online collaborative journal this week with your team members. Here are two more ideas. On the left is an example of a self-assessment rubric that you could adapt for your own unit or lesson and get your students to complete as they move throughout the unit. Get them to check in regularly about their own learning. So you can see here they've highlighted, I can do this on my own and explain how to do it to others. I can do this on my own. I can do this if I get help or look at an example. It'd be great to see lots of crosses in this box, wouldn't it? Over here, we're using the language of speed bumps or detours that could assist your students to write reflexively in their learning journals. What were the challenges, the things that are slowing them down? Or what are the detours that require your students to go off and find new information? Ask your students to think about how often they are experiencing the speed bumps or the detours. How steep were the speed bumps? How extensive are the detours? How do they think they're going to overcome these? How are you going to help them overcome these? Often I think there are close links and even some overlaps between assessment for learning and assessment as learning. Both types of strategies inform you, the teacher, how you might need to adjust your own teaching or to provide additional support. However, assessment as learning, when the student themselves is reflexive about their own learning, helps to shift some of the responsibility for learning to the student. Here are another two examples that you could use. On the right is a simple rubric. What can I do now? What I want to do next? When I did it? How did I feel about this? Using simple emoticons that students can circle. On the left is the pass the remote template. That would be the word. What would your student like to rewind? Go back and do it again and have another think about it. What do they want to record about their learning that will help them to remember, or I prefer the term understand it? What about changing channels? What would they do differently? And so on. In this slide are two different ways to potentially assess teamwork. I quite like this one over here. What's your contribution been like? How much responsibility have you taken? How well have you valued other people's ideas? And the criteria, I've barely done any of this. I need to work on this. I'm doing all right, but I could do better. I'm doing a great job. It's also important to help your students focus on their thinking, on being metacognitive. Studies have shown that when students are metacognitive, they achieve much higher results in their learning. So, for example, in here, very, very difficult to see, so let me read it for you. It's important to ask the students what they thought of, what they thought about, what they wondered, what they questioned, what connections did they make. And over here in the 6 thinking hats example, what new information did I learn? What got in the way of effective thinking? How do I feel about my thinking? What new ideas did I come up with? What did I think through really, really well? And how did I organise my ideas? Both of these templates help to get students to understand that sometimes we need to work at our thinking. Another approach that many schools and classrooms are taking is to use Art de Costa's habits of mind. And you can pause here and read through this particular diagram that goes through all the different habits of thinking that we should be engaging in. And I guess the issue here is this is a great prompt for students to think about how they're thinking. Time to pause again and reflect. Take out your original Y chart. Use a different colour to blue this time and write down what assessment as learning might look like, feel like, and sound like for a student. Leave a little bit more room, there's one more entry to go. Now we move on to assessment of learning. This is probably the form of assessment that most teachers have done the most of. At university, it's also the type of assessment we are most focused on. Assessment for and as learning is much harder to achieve in a university setting than in a school classroom, but possibly something we need to improve on. The possibilities for how you assess whether students have achieved the learning intentions you have set are enormous and limited only by your creativity and imagination as a teacher. I've listed some of the most common strategies here, some of which I find of limited value, such as quizzes and tests, and I do have personal preferences for some and biases against others, as you will also have. You might notice here that I haven't mentioned the word worksheet as an assessment task. I wonder why that might be. Think about the sorts of assessment strategies that you would like to have. And here is a pause for reflection time again. Write down as many of the assessment of learning strategies that you have used or seen used on your placements. You could instead try some of these. This one over here is an example of a corkboard, an online corkboard, that allows students to arrange ideas and even add in images, videos, sound, links to relevant websites. This is an example of an iPad app, but it's also available for other mobile devices and can be used on a computer. This particular app is called LinoIt, but there are others, a multitude of others around that do similar things, such as Calculus and Padlet and even Poplet. You could use an inspiration map. It's a concept mapping application called Inspiration Maps, again available for all sorts of different tablets and devices. And using something like this is really important in getting students to demonstrate their understanding of relationships between different elements within an overarching concept. This one down here is using a comic strip as a way of representing this student's understanding of the life cycle of a particular bug. How about you use something like iMovie and get the students to create a video that again represents their understanding. Technology affords our students really creative and open-ended ways of representing what they know and understand, and should be part of your suite of assessment strategies. Here are 3 more examples. Write a blog. This guy down here might look a little bit familiar to some of you. It's an app called Telegami, but there are other substitutes for it, creating an animation. And this one over here is an example of an infographic. An infographic is a highly visual presentation of information, data or knowledge that's intended to present information quickly and clearly. You could think about some other examples as well, such as cartoons, comic strips, a debate, write and perform a play, create an artwork, etc., etc., etc. The list is endless. This is your final reflection. Take out your Y chart and a third coloured pen or textile, and by now you should be able to guess. Add in, what does assessment of learning look like, feel like, and sound like for a student? Use your Y chart and your concept circles to inform your group discussion about learning and teaching across the curriculum in this week's online activity. In the next online lecture, we will probably be looking at the final step of the planning, the curriculum design process, and that is the explicit teaching.